Here is Tulsi Gabbard talking about Marco Rubio when he was being considered as a vice presidential candidate earlier this summer.
I think it would be a huge mistake for President Trump to choose him because he represents the neocon warmongering establishment of Washington, D.C., which stands diametrically opposed to the very policies that President Trump has always stood for, going all the way back to when he ran for president in 2016 through that first term in office, and the things that he's talking about wanting to do now. And it would send the wrong message to a lot of folks who are very concerned about the fact that we are on the brink of war with Russia and China and Iran and North Korea. If Marco Rubio is his vice president, then that is what we will face, and it will cause a lot of people to question what kind of foreign policy will actually be executed. Will it be the one that Trump wants and stands for, or will it be one that will continue the deep state neocon warmongers who've gotten us into the mess that we are in now?
Hard to argue with that same prohibition against him being the vice presidential candidate to be the Secretary of State, because it does seem to be opposed to what Trump says he stands for. How do you see it?
Well, obviously, I think Tulsi Gabbard would make a much better Secretary of State because she represents the more balanced and nuanced approach to foreign policy and recognizes the criticality of avoiding war. I think Tulsi Gabbard and others that support Donald Trump, like me, have to come to the conclusion that what Trump thinks is either unclear or it's clear. And he has hitched his wagon 100% to the Zionist cause in the Middle East, which means war to expand the state of Israel and destroy everyone that Israel doesn't like or Israel fears. That includes, first and foremost, Iran. I think he and his team are committed to that objective. That's where we're headed. If anybody has any questions about it, start paying attention to what people actually say. At some point, you have to listen to people and believe them. And President Trump has made very clear statements about Iran and where he expects to go. And if anything, he's being critical for the most part of the Biden administration for not doing enough against Iran. And I think Waltz and Hegseth are of the same mindset. So is Rubio. I think anybody who shows up in the State Department is going to have to toe that line, which is why I don't think Tulsi will show up there. But if she did, she would be swimming in unfriendly waters. She'd probably have Brian Hook as her deputy and be surrounded by dozens of people in the State Department who are plugging the same line. This is the problem. They say, well, nominate so-and-so, he can go in there and make a difference. It's not easy. It doesn't work that way. If you show up with the kinds of views that Tulsi Gabbard has, you're going to be the lone ranger in the biggest rainstorm you've ever seen. And what we're headed towards right now is really the storm of the century. Now, you can quibble about qualifications. Who's qualified, who isn't? You know, for instance, somebody called me, a journalist, and said, what do you think about Pompeo? I said, well, listen, I don't share his views. He and I have virtually nothing in common in terms of our views of the world, but Pompeo is qualified to be Secretary of Defense. There's no question about that. Would I support it? No, and I would argue against it. I'm glad he's not on his way into that job. Then you have to turn your attention to the others that are being appointed in various positions, like Waltz and now Hegseth, and you have to ask, where's the evidence for the kinds of things that you would look for in those positions? And I don't see much evidence for them. I mean, I don't want to be that harsh. A friend of mine who's a retired four-star, and yes, I do have some four-star friends that are retired, sent me a note and he said, this is like appointing a tattoo artist to run healthcare for the country. Well, I don't think it's that bad, but people ought to be more concerned about what does this man really know? What does he bring to it? Now, if you're on the Hill, if you're in the Senate, and Rick Scott has made this very clear that whomever Trump, wants in those jobs, he's going to deliver. And I think you've got to keep in mind that once again, the basic question is, where do you stand on war with Iran? What are you prepared to do? That's very important. That's the litmus test right now.
And according
all
to
of
that
these
litmus
people
test,
pass that test, Dan. I don't. You don't, but they do.
And towards that to end on that litmus test, how about Mike Waltz? Where does he come down on that?
Oh, I think he's very strongly in support of it. He was the guy that just a few weeks ago was arguing we need to give more strike weapons to Ukraine so that they can do more harm to the Russians. I mean, he's done an about face on that, much like Hegseth has, because Trump has, and has moved in a different direction. But these are people that are all ambitious, and that's a good thing. But they're also well aware of which way the wind is blowing. Remember, the problem on the Hill is preeminently concerned about keeping the money flowing. That's the other issue. Are you going to keep the money flowing behind closed doors? You're not going to change anything, are you? Don't slow it down. We got to keep it going. And that's what everybody has done now for decades. Oh, we'll keep it going. Don't worry about it, Senator. We'll keep it going. My shipyards have to operate. They have to produce. I got it. I understand that. That's where we are. Okay. And I think these people are all signed on for that. Radcliffe as well. But none of these people are people that you would compare with, say, someone like Paul Nitze, who was Secretary of the Navy, who was a very thoughtful man. And he struggled, in the Navy with ship design like everybody else, because he got tired of seeing the same ships turned out from shipyards that were clearly obsolete when there should have been new ships with, based on new designs.
Yeah.
He was moderately successful, not much, but at least he was a thoughtful man. He understood the strategic calculus. He was part of a generation of people, Republicans and Democrats, who all understood what the word war means. These people don't. They think war is Afghanistan. This is what I call bullet launchers against bullet launchers. We've talked about this before.
Yeah.
The kind of war you want to avoid is one where the enemy shoots his AKs and you shoot your M16s. That's called symmetric warfare. We don't want it. We don't want to be involved with it. And somebody with an AK in a distant, remote place of no value to us, no education, and 16 brothers and sisters is just a drop in the bucket and can be killed and replaced instantly. But the people we commit are educated, trained, and they come from families that love them and know them. And they're only family, 2 or 3, perhaps in that family at most. The Israelis are in the same boat. Is that where we want to waste our human capital on these kinds of stupid things? And Tulsi Gabbard has said, no, we don't. She stands for that. I say, no, we don't. That's absolutely clear. All of a sudden, we're back to the same old thing. Well, Ukraine hasn't gone so well. Forget Ukraine. It's going to go away. It's like Vietnam. It went away. Now, what are we going to do? Oh, well, we got a new war to fight. That's in the Middle East. We got to join Israel and wipe out Iran. Nobody asks the question is, what does wipe out Iran mean? And if it means Iran's total destruction, how does that help us? And who does that bring into the equation for discussion? Nobody cares. It's not important. The average American listens and says, oh, yeah. Oh, those Iranians, they're bad guys. He's listened to that from Fox News, NBC, CNN forever. He doesn't know anything about Iran. And all of a sudden, oh, yeah, well, we'll bomb Iran. No biggie. Let me get back to work.
Yeah.
That's a bad assumption.
Yeah, this is like as though they're Syria. I think it was like Obama, Trump, and Biden all at one point or another launched some strikes into Syria, and there was, of course, Syria can't do anything about it. And I think that they think the same thing for Iran, but obviously that's going to be a significant difference.
For what it's worth, I wrote a paper, and I was encouraged to write this paper. It's long, which is always bad because no one in the United States likes to read anything that's more than a few hundred words. This is long. It's 5,700 words. And it looks, what do we need? We need a new strategy. What's that strategy look like? Then what are we going to do about the armed forces? How do we design them? What's driving change? And finally, what are we going to do about the overhead? What's the overhead? And it goes through it pretty systematically. And it's posted by on a website, an anti-war website that supported RFK Jr. It's going to be posted sometime today by Dan McAdams on Ron Paul's website at the Ron Paul Institute. I encourage people to look at it because it was written to be a blueprint that could be a start point for fundamental change, for diverging from the failed policies of the last 3+ decades and move us in a new, more productive direction. It'll be castigated and hated by the neocons and their supporters who want us to go to war with Iran. And it doesn't say don't go to war with Iran or go to war with anybody. On the contrary, it says we need a new strategy. This is the framework, and we need new forces to implement it, because the forces we have really are based on something that emerged from the Second World War that's almost 100 years ago. So I encourage people to look at that. I think the easiest access is probably to the Ron Paul Institute's website. People ought to look at it. You don't have to agree with all of it, but consider it as an alternative to where we're headed. And I think we're headed in a very dangerous direction. We haven't even talked, you and I, about the financial system.
Right.
You know, our banking system, according to all of the experts, whether it's James Ricards or Peter Druckenmiller or Gundlach or Nassim Taleb, is 8 times worse today in terms of fragility than it was in 2008. Hello, are we crazy? This isn't going to survive this kind of war, particularly if we go back to where you started. And suddenly Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, which have historically aligned with us, have marched out of our camp and said, no, we don't support this, and decide to pull all of their wealth out.
Yeah.
What do we do at that point? What's the impact on us? Well, I think we know.
And of course, you know, you say you hope people read this part paper here. Of course, I wish I could get it in front of Donald Trump, because that would like be a blueprint for everything he says he stands for. This is how you execute it, which is why I was unshy about tweeting out and several other things that I thought you should have been the Secretary of Defense, because you understand how it needs to happen. I wish Tulsi Gabbard, I recommended that she also be elevated as Secretary of State, because I think that would have, the two most powerful people, I think, in those two positions would have really helped Trump operationalize his vision, and all of America would have benefited from it. And I fear that some of the people he's tied himself to may go in the opposite direction.
Well, Dan, consider this. The President of the United States is unique in the world because he is simultaneously both the head of state, which is normally where you see a king or an emperor, and at the same time, he's the political leader of the country, and especially his party. So he's two things at once. Now, why is that important? Because a lot of people invested very heavily in him for the purpose of getting him elected so that he would back the war against Iran. That needs to be understood. Now, it's very, very difficult under the circumstances for him to ignore that, even though it's obviously in the interest of the American people, in my judgment, to stay away from that option. But he has to take their views into consideration. Anybody who thinks that money in politics really doesn't buy you anything is wrong. Money buys a lot. And cold hard cash in great quantities has a reason or a reasoning of its own. And you can't survive in politics without it, or at least that's the view. And that's where we are. And it's not just President Trump, it's the entire government.
What could he do to navigate that, try to thread that needle you're talking about there, but with these people he has in place to still get them to do his vision of the world and keep us out of wars?
Well, I'm not sure that's his vision. It's a good question. What is his real vision? You also, in addition to listening to what people say, you've also got to look at what they do. When you look at the cabinet, that's what he's doing. And if you don't think that matches things that he said in the past, well, then which side do you come down on? You have to come down on the side of what does he do? So I think it's pretty clear. Now, every president, and let there be no mistake about this, has the right to select whomever the hell he wants. Now, the Senate doesn't necessarily have to comply. And clearly, during his last administration, he had no support from anybody on the Hill. Mitch McConnell ran a very powerful campaign of prevarication and outright disobedience and opposition. And he had the support of Schumer and his friends in the Democratic Party. This time it's a little different. The Republicans are going to control the Senate. But at the same time, remember that Senate doesn't have to do that. They could resist. They could say thanks, but no thanks. But historically, Senate has turned out to be a rubber stamp Roman Senate. And the president is effectively being like the emperor. Unless, of course, it represents a disruption in the money flow. If you're going to stop the money, that's bad news. And so anybody who talks about cutting anything in terms of spending, I'm afraid things are going to have to progress to the point where there is no longer any choice but to cut. And we're not as far from that as many people think. And again, I cite the people, Ricards and the others. And remember, debt has always brought down empires. And we are an empire at this point, like it or not.